Well, it is about time to get started. One quick announcement that I got from in between services. Linda Milliron on Friday fell and broke her wrist, and she is going to go see an orthopedic this week, and she's pretty sore and banged up, is what Farrell says. So please keep Linda in your prayers. All right. Were there any other announcements that didn't get announced this morning? Let me just reiterate, our spring Easter picnic will be on the 19th, and so please be bringing in, just over the course of the week, and up until that day, please be bringing in some Easter eggs that are already pre-filled, and we'll have a good hunt with the kids, and hopefully it won't rain on us this year. I think it was 2 years ago that it rained, but let's hope it doesn't rain this year. So just keep those things in mind. All right, we are going to be taking a brief break with our Sermon on the Mount series we've been doing. We're getting close to the end of that series, but we're going to take a little break for this month and focus in on something different. Appreciate everybody that came to our service Sunday last week, and I think we had a good time, and appreciate Sonny for taking those pictures that have been on the slideshow running. Our Service Sunday project for this coming month will be a door-knocking campaign, I guess, so to speak. I'm not sure exactly how we're going to divide it up and what specific areas we'll target. We can talk about that in a little bit. But what I do want us to be thinking about over the course of this month is the idea of evangelism and some of the do's and don'ts of evangelism. And so our kind of whole series for this next month will be Teaching with Tact. Do we have the PowerPoint up? So we're going to look at some things to do and some things not to do in some personal evangelism because all Christians are called to be evangelistic. And that doesn't mean that all Christians have to fulfill the exact same roles in their evangelism. Not everyone's going to be a preacher, and not everyone's going to be a Bible class teacher, but we all should be evangelists in one sense or another, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. But we all have an obligation for it. So we're going to spend this month taking a little break from our Sermon on the Mount to talk about teaching and teaching with tact. So let's kind of begin by looking at some facts. There are a lot of churches that are struggling in the United States. And I don't think that's a surprise to you, and that's certainly not a surprise to me. It's something you've probably seen firsthand. It's something that you've probably seen secondhand. But when you look around, it's very clear that there are declining rates of religiosity in the United States. And I'm not limiting that to churches of Christ in particular, but very broadly speaking. There's a lot of churches that are struggling and are in decline. There's a study from Gallup that in the past 25 years, regular attendance among churches of Christ, it was Christian Chronicle, not Gallup, have fallen from 1,284,056 members to 1,183,613 members over the past 25 years. I don't know if is that more than you would have thought, or is that less than you would have thought. It's about a 100,000 person difference. Is that more or less than you would have expected? Do what? Let me pull out my calculator real quick. Yeah, let me pull out my calculator. 8%, is that what we said? Okay, so yeah, that's a 8% decline over the past 25 years. And that study is a little bit dated. That study came out, I think, in 2016 or something like that. So, that was a decade ago, just about. So things are changed in that time frame. But is that more or less than you would have thought? Yeah, less than you think you're told? What do you mean by that? Yeah. 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 Here's the thing about statistics, and you see a lot of statistics that are just thrown out. Almost always, and particularly when we talk about Church of Christ statistics, they're very hard to accurately gauge. And so, in particular, when we talk about churches of Christ and we try and track attendance statistics among churches across the country, it's really, really hard, if not almost impossible. Why would that be? Why do you think? Yeah, we don't have a reporting system. We're autonomous, right? We are the Dayton Church of Christ. Bethel down in Sequatchie Valley, is Bethel Church of Christ. And we do things together. We have a good relationship together. But we're not overseen by some higher body that tabulates these things. I have a couple friends that are Baptist preachers, and every Sunday they have to submit their Sunday attendance numbers into the denominational board that keeps track of their numbers. And so when you think about like the Southern Baptist Convention, the numbers that they provide, those numbers are much more accurately reported than if you say numbers for churches of Christ, just because we don't keep those types of records, and we don't have a institutional board that keeps track of those things in a way that a lot of denominational groups do. And so whenever you see stats like that, take it with a grain of salt to some degree. But I don't think it's any surprise that generally churches have declined in numbers. I think that is just the status that we understand, and you've probably seen it. And I know that we've had a good uptick here at Dayton, but we're not the maximum number. This is not the highest attendance that Dayton has ever had, right? I know that for some of you that have been here a long term, there have been times and there have been periods, and it tends to fluctuate, periods where churches grow and churches decline. And I think we're in a good growth phase right now, but we are not at the height of what Dayton has been historically. And that's the case for a lot of churches, is that a lot of churches have entered a period of decline. Doesn't mean that they're going to stay in decline, and I think that in a lot of cases they don't, but church numbers fluctuate. And by and large, though, the phase of play, I guess, is that a lot of churches are in states of decline right now. And I think that you can see that throughout the world. Throughout the United States, at least, let me put it that way. And then I think another major factor when we think about the decline of churches is there is a sharp lack of men willing and qualified to step into leadership. And this is a problem that is universal in the church. And it always has been universal in the church. Even back in Paul's day. Paul, you may remember, meets with a church that was comprised of just women, in Acts. And so, there's always been a struggle with getting good, godly men that are qualified to step into leadership positions. Positions like elderships and deacons have very, spelled out qualities that the men must meet. It's hard to find men that meet those qualifications often. And then even when you may have some men that meet those qualifications, one of the qualities is that they must desire it. And that knocks out some other potential leaders. And so there's a leadership crisis in the church by and large. And we're very blessed to have elders and deacons. You look at the rate of men going into ministry, like preacher positions, like what I do, that's declining in some places, not everywhere, but that's in decline as well. And so there's a lot of issues that are being faced. One of my friends, classmate, his name's Walter Gardner. He is one of my classmates in this doctoral program that I've been doing. He preaches up in New Jersey, and he works primarily with black churches. And one of his big areas of focus is trying to get, particularly it's a challenge in the Northeast. There's almost no churches in the Northeast with elderships. And he has kind of committed his life work to training and developing men to be leaders, church leaders. And there's a lot of work to do. So why is it that we have struggled in some of these areas? Why do we have lack of men willing to go into leadership? And why are numbers generally trending down? What's the root issues here? What might you say?
We've seen elders be abused.
How so?
Expect too much. They're still human.
Yeah.
And my opinion is always right, your opinion is not.
Yeah.
Why don't the elders always need to be surrounded?
Yeah. Part of the problem for men going into positions of leadership is we treat our leadership very badly, right? And hypercritical. And criticism is not necessarily a bad thing. And there's times for criticism, and there's ways to deliver criticism, and we often don't do that well. And so rather than step into a position where your every move is going to have opponents that are going to be loud and vocal in opposition to you, a lot of people just say, I don't want that headache in my life. And so they just don't do it. What might be some other reasons here? What do you mean by that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Sometimes people are just they don't feel able to fill the position. And sometimes people are kind of foisted into it. So as we think about it, all of the stats that you see a lot of stats that are out there. Not everything is doom and gloom. And the people that tell you everything is doom and gloom are looking at too narrow a scope, or they're not being totally honest. And so there are certainly problems that need addressed. But the church is not ending tomorrow, right? It has endured for 2,000 years, and it's going to continue to endure. And so some positive things to think about. Religious decline has stabilized in the U.S. For a long time, you would hear stats like, more people are leaving the church this year than ever before. That's not been true for about 3 years. For the past 3 years, it seems religious decline, this is broadly speaking here, has stayed steady. And actually, it's gone up in the past couple of years. And so religious decline is stabilized. We're not in a free fall. So I think that's sometimes the perspective that we hear a lot. And anecdotally, I think you can see this a lot of the times too. There's a lot of churches that are growing and growing really rapidly. I think about in Memphis, the Great Oaks Church where I was working before coming here. When we were there in Memphis, Great Oaks was about 500-ish members. Now they're pushing 700, and they're doing a church plant because they can't contain everybody. And a lot of that, some of that might be some shuffling of churches and that sort of thing, but a lot of that is very organic growth. It's new converts and that sort of thing. And so that's one example, but that's a good example. I think here at Dayton, we've had a pretty good round of growth the past couple years. When we first came here, it was right after COVID, so keep that in mind. But maybe 70 on Sunday is what we were having. And you look at the board, and that's not 70. That's a pretty big difference. And so part of that is new people coming in. Part of that is new Christians coming in. Part of that is people that were out for COVID coming back. But there's a lot of reasons, but there's been growth there. One of the interesting things, I may have talked to some of you all about this, but I'm planning on doing some research on church merging in next year or so for school. And I have preliminarily talked with about 20 churches that have merged since COVID. And in about 95% of those churches that I've talked to, they've had rapid growth since their mergers. And so I can think of a church in Oklahoma that was 150, and they merged with a church of about 150. Now they're pushing 500. There's a church in Pennsylvania that was about 60 members, and then they merged with a church of about 20 members, and now they're pushing 100 to 120-ish. There's a church in Alabama that was about 150. They merged with a church of about 80. Now they're pushing 300-ish. And all of that since COVID. And, I could keep going. I got about 20 of them. And in almost every single situation there, not every, but almost every that I've looked at, there's been rapid growth there. And that's not even to mention, we sometimes fall into the trap of thinking about the church only in terms of the United States. And that's wrong. The church is not just the United States. And you look overseas, and there's extreme growth happening in the church overseas. One of my classmates, his name's Manny. He's the most impressive person I've ever met in my life. He's a surgeon. He runs a hospital, and he's also runs a school of preaching, and he preaches full-time at like 3 churches, and he's just overachiever there. But Manny is baptizing dozens and dozens of people every week, and they're planting new churches almost every couple months because there's just such a desire for it. And I've got friends overseas in Africa and China and all throughout the world that are seeing periods of great growth. And so sometimes talking about statistics not always being the full story, we hear statistics about churches declining, man. It is just really going through a rough period. Well, maybe it's going through a rough period where you are. That may be very well true. Maybe it's going through a rough period in the United States. But that's not a total picture of the church worldwide. And that's a hard thing to kind of capture, but I think it's an important thing to realize. Any thoughts about that? There was a book I was reading recently, and it had this quote or something along this line. And I think this is an important thing to realize. And this will kind of segue into our next part. Every church is accomplishing exactly what it's set up to accomplish. And I understand, what Paul says when he says, I plant, Apollos watered, God gives the growth. I understand that completely. But I think there's a lot of truth in this passage, or this phrase as well. We're accomplishing what we're designed to accomplish. And I think that often we look at troubles in the church, and we can identify the negative outcomes. But what we need to be doing is identifying the factors that lead to those negative outcomes. If a church is dying, if a church is declining, why is it declining? What is wrong in the church that is leading to decline? And people will often say, well, people just don't want to hear the gospel anymore. Perhaps that's a piece of the puzzle in that attitudes have changed, especially in our culture today. But that is not the totality of the picture, right? There's a lot of other factors that may be at play. Perhaps we're not evangelizing like we should. Perhaps we're not spiritually healthy like we should be. There's some dysfunction happening in the church that's leading to its unhealthiness. And so that dysfunction needs to be addressed if we want to see a change of outcomes. And so I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Paul and Apollos were doing the work. The growth is to the glory of God. God gives the growth, but they need to be doing the work. And I think often we see decline in the church, and the result is not that God has just decided, well, I don't want the church to grow anymore. I think often the cause for that might be, well, maybe we've not been watering and planting like we ought. And so with that in mind, let's think about, why does a church become stagnant? And I got my first one up there, I guess. Part of that reason is because we compartmentalize our faith. You look at Romans, flip over there to Romans chapter 12. Let's read through this real quick. Romans chapter 12, verse 9 through 11. Let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, and hold fast to what's good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal, but be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. And I think often we don't do that fully. We have our church self, we have our home self, we have our work self, and the three shall never meet, right? But that's not healthy faith. True, genuine faith is loving what's good, hating what's evil. You don't love what's good here when you're in the church building, and you love what's evil when you go home. That's not genuine faith. And yet, for many, many people, we have grown to just compartmentalize our faith. Faith is something we do in specific places, at specific times, with specific people. And, it would be odd for me to go, have a Bible study with my family at night before bed. That would be weird. It would feel weird. Well, why is that? It's because we've segmented our lives in an unhealthy way. And so I think one major problem for church growth becoming stale is we don't behave like Christians ought to behave in, week in, week out. When we go home, when we go to church, and when we go to work, and when we go to school, and when we go wherever we go, we kind of put on those hats. So what might be some other factors that have led to growth stagnation in the church? So I think we all want the church to be healthy. I think we all want the church to grow. I think that's very clearly why you're here. But what might be some factors that have led to church stagnation? Yeah. So part of that might be just a failure to plan ahead and meet needs before they come. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Sometimes you hear about the 80% rule. When churches reach 80% of their capacity seating-wise, they stop growing because it becomes uncomfortable. And, it's hard when you come in with a big family of kids, it's hard to find a place to sit. And so sometimes that's a part of it. And I think that's a principle that goes beyond just buildings, but in a lot of other areas, we don't plan for the future. You suddenly find your church, perhaps you're a church with an eldership you got a church with 2 elders, and one of your elders dies, and now suddenly you have this big problem. Well, who's going to step up and take his place? There's nobody trained to step up and take his place. Well, that's a problem that should have been addressed 10 years before the elder died who died. And so there's a lot of foresight that needs to go into church growth. Plan for the future. What might be some other issues? Yeah, and I think this is something we see a lot, which is there's a natural reshuffling of, I think Sequatchie Valley is a really good example of this, and there's a church in every little community in the county, right? And there's a time where that was really needed because those people were getting to church on horse and buggy, right? A lot of those churches go back to the 1800s or earlier. And that was a really good thing. And now we live in a time where you just hop in your car and it's nothing to go, to Walmart go to Dayton for Walmart or whatever. And so there has been a natural reshuffling of sorts. And I think that is one of the major factors that we see in church decline, is that it's not even that the children are growing up and becoming unfaithful, but it's they're growing up and reshuffling to another congregation that has things to meet their needs in a way that other churches aren't. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes this is my next point. I'll take it. We fail to live like the early church. And I think this is a big part. This ties into, we compartmentalize, but look at Acts chapter 2, verse 42 through 48. So this is immediately after Sermon at Pentecost. Verse 42, they devoted themselves. That word devote is a very strong word, right? And it's not like, they kind of devote, they just kind of participated in. No, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to the prayers. And all came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. And so when you think about how do the early church function, what are the things they do? Well, obviously worship is a big part of it, right? That's crucial. But the idea of fellowship, I think, is something we have not done super well at. It's not just that they meet once a week on Sundays to get together, although they do meet once a week on Sundays to get together, but they are part of each other's lives, day by day. They eat together. They spend time together. They are aware and are willing to sacrifice for the needs of one another. And I think in a lot of ways, as a church, I think this is particularly an American church problem, we do not do that. We are so hyper-individual, right? Everything is, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and, make it out on your own. And like those are the ideals of American society. And that's just not the way that the early church operates. They are a unit. They are a church. They are a family together. And you become a part of that family. And it's not just I go there and, I kind of sit in the back pew and then I'm out as soon as church is done. And that's not how they operate. They are a part of each other's lives. And I think a really clear indication of this, you think about in 1 Corinthians 5, you have a guy who is, having sex with his father's wife. And Paul says, this is outrageous. And it's outrageous that you as a church are permitting this and you don't care about this. And in fact, you're kind of proud of it. And what you ought to do is what? What's he tell them? Purge the evil one from your midst, right? And he says, listen, the purpose of this is not just to be mean. That they cannot have fellowship with you because they are engaged in sin. And he says in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 5, let's just go ahead and read it because I'm going to misquote it. 1 Corinthians 5:5. 5:2 and then 5:5. 5:2, and you are arrogant. Ought you not rather mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you. Verse 5, you are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit might be saved in the day of the Lord. And then you look at 2 Corinthians, and you see that this man, probably the same man, repents, and Paul says, listen, it's good enough. He's come back. Welcome him back as a brother. I often hear people say, church discipline does not work because, you're just casting them away from the church. They'll never, ever come back. And so church discipline does not work. What's the problem? Why does church discipline not work, so to speak? Do what? Yeah, sometimes it's not done in a godly way, right? Sometimes it is done maliciously. That's wrong. Then the idea of, well, what is the purpose? One, the purpose, and this is the purpose that most people think of first, is to save the soul, right? Someone is in error, you got to save the soul. But Paul also says there's a second purpose, which is it preserves the purity of the rest of the congregation. So church discipline will always work, at least at number 2. At number 1, though, it will work if the church fellowship is something that's worth being missed, right? What's the big deal if you are you have been disciplined as a church member and you were never there to begin with anyway, right? What are you missing? Well, you're not missing anything, right? And what you see in 1 Corinthians is that church fellowship is such an important part of every member's life that the thought of being removed from the church is a horrible thought. And for many of you, I would say that's something you can relate with. The thought of not being able to be in good fellowship with your friends and your family and the people you love at the church, that is a deterrent from you acting and behaving in ways that you ought not be acting and behaving. And that's a church operating well. But there's a lot of people that's not the case. And they don't have a tight fellowship with their church. And for them, well, okay, I'm not a part of this anymore, I guess. Oh, well. They can say, oh, well. Clearly, what you see here in 1 Corinthians is that it was destructive for this guy. It was a wake-up call. That the people that I love and are such a big part of my life are correcting me and taking action because of my behavior, and it's my actions that have made this division. I need to course correct. I think that a big part of why church discipline doesn't work, so to speak, often, is because we don't live like the early church. That's a big reason why I think the church fails to grow, is because we don't practice the type of community and the type of friendships and relationships that you saw in the early church. So I think that's a big one. Another one, we fail to grow ourselves spiritually. Look at Hebrews chapter 5. And then we'll go through to chapter 11, or chapter 6. Hebrews 5:11, the Hebrew author is writing a warning here. He says, about this we have much to say, and it's hard to explain since you have become dull of hearing. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles and the oracles of God. You need milk and not solid food. For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness since he's a child. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. Therefore, let's leave the elementary doctrines of Christ and go on to maturity, not laying again a foundation of repentance from the dead works, but of faith towards God, and the instruction about the washings, the laying on of hands, the resurrection of the dead, and eternal judgment. What's he saying here? He says, listen, I have a lot of important things I want to tell you, but you guys are not ready for it. You are spiritually immature. You should be teachers, but rather than teaching, you need to be taught. And that's kind of a shameful thing, right? He's calling them babies. You need milk. You can't eat real food. You just need the basics. We need to move past the basics and go on to the more weighty matters, the more significant, the more difficult things that you got to wrestle with. And, there's a lot of people that are in the infant stage of faith. And if that's where you are, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being a child, being a baby. But what's wrong is when you stay at that phase. And that's a problem. And so, if you see a 40-year-old who behaves like a 2-year-old, you got a problem there. They've not matured like they should. The church, I think, is too often filled with people that are spiritually children and are not prepared to go on to spiritual adulthood. And that's a problem that Paul says, or not Paul, the Hebrew author, it's been around ever since the first century, that people should be maturing spiritually, but they're not. And I think one of the big problems in the church, why don't we have good, godly leaders? It's because we have stunted spiritual growth individually. We get to a point, we call ourselves good, and we're satisfied, and we don't pursue it any further. And that's a real problem. What do you think about any of these things so far? Any thoughts? Do you agree, disagree? Yeah. Yeah, none of these are new things. Yeah. Yeah, each one of these have always been a problem, and they will always be a problem. But a church that wants to be healthy and a church that wants to grow has to combat these things. And they have to be genuine, and they have to live like the church, and they have to grow. You have something, Rick?
Back to your early church. Having your biological family all be faithful is a great thing.
Yeah.
And that's not bad in and of itself. But if you claim to only your biological family members and don't welcome them folks, or if you been in the congregation for 100 years and your best friend has been in the congregation for 100 years, and you're not willing to welcome anybody else in, that's a closed congregation.
Yeah. Yeah. I think sometimes we get so stuck in routines and the way things have been. And routines are good things. Like, I am very much a routine-oriented person. But growth is a change, is it not? And stagnation, growth is a change, decline is a change, stagnation is not. And so we don't want to decline. That's a bad change. We don't want to be stagnant, which is everything stays exactly how it has been for the rest of the time. For growth, there has to be some change. And I don't mean like change things that are core to your doctrine, core to biblical practice. But, if you welcome in a new family, is there not a change that has happened? A just dynamic change in the church? Of course there are. There's new people. There's new relationships to form. There has been a change. And a church that is, so rigidly, against change of any form, that's not a church that will be growing, because it will not be willing or able to accommodate the change that is required by new people coming in. Does that make sense? So, okay, and then we'll get to the last one here. And I think, finally, we fail to evangelize. And I think failure to evangelize is kind of, in a lot of ways, a summary of these other issues. Why don't we evangelize? Well, we don't evangelize because evangelism requires authentic faith, right? You're not going to go evangelize and speak to non-Christians about your faith if you don't care enough about your faith to bring it home with you. You're just not going to do it. And speaking of evangelism, what are we going to invite people to if we don't have a church that behaves like the early church? One of the biggest draws for people coming into the church is, this is a place where people love each other, and people love you, and people love your kids, and people take an interest and invest themselves in you. And you can, I think this is a big problem in the church too. We baptize people and then we drop them. And they're, we did what we did, now we're done, and there's no more interest, no follow-up. Well, that's not how an early church behaves, right? If you have a child that's born into a family, do you just say, well, you're here now, kid, good luck? That's what gazelles do, and we're not gazelles. There's cheetahs out there. And so what a healthy church does, you have a spiritual infant in your congregation. That doesn't mean that they're a little child. Could be a 80-year-old spiritual infant. They nurture that child, and they grow them spiritually. And I think that's often one of the failures of evangelism, is we don't go beyond the birth process into the church, so to speak. I think sometimes we fail to share the truth because we're just not capable. And by not capable, I mean we have not developed ourselves spiritually enough to have something that we're able to share with others. And I think that's a big problem. And then sometimes I think we're just so comfortable that we just don't care to reach the lost. We're good inside, and those outside, if they want to come inside, that's fine. But I'm not going to go out drag them. I'm not going to go out and try and convince them. Our doors are open. We have a sign outside that says our worship times, and if they don't come, well, that's just on them. That's a really bad attitude. And so I think sometimes we just fail to evangelize, period, because we're just comfortable. So in the little bit of time we got left, James chapter 4, verse 17 is a scary verse. To him that knows to do good and fails to do it, to him it is what? Sin. And I don't think there's anybody that would argue that evangelism is not a required thing of the church, and that evangelism is not a good thing to do. You look at Matthew 28, the very last things Jesus says before he ascends into heaven. He says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." And how do you do that? By baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. Behold, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. It is a clear-cut command. And, I don't know how you can get around that. I don't know how you can claim to be a faithful follower of Christ and not do the things that he has told you to do. You can't. And in fact, failure to do that is not just a failure it's a sin problem. And so excuses don't cut it. And you think about Moses here. Moses is the king of excuses. God had a thing that he wanted Moses to do, lead my people out of Israel, out of Egypt. Moses came up with every excuse in the book. I'm not a good speaker. Well, don't tell me what you can't do, because I created your mouth, I created you, I'm telling you can do it. Well, they won't believe me. Well, you have my words, it's not just your word. I just really don't want to do this. Well, good thing Aaron's here, he's coming with you. The excuses didn't cut it. Moses didn't come up with this great excuse. Well, I can't possibly do that because I'm just not a good... and God said, well, you know what? You're right, Moses. I'm so sorry for asking you. That's not at all what happened. God says, go get over there and tell them what I'm telling you to tell. Be my mouthpiece. Be my spokesperson. And so Moses ends up doing it. But his excuses just didn't cut it. And I think sometimes we make a lot of excuses. And we'll wrap up here. But one more verse. Look at Matthew chapter 10. I think one of the big excuses we make, we go through all the Moses excuses, right? I'm not good enough. Somebody else is better at this. I don't want to do this alone. All of those things. We do all of those. And I think another really big excuse that we make is, I've been talking to so-and-so. I've been talking to my brother. I've been talking to a friend at work for years. And, I've been pouring all my energy into so-and-so for all these years. And so surely that's sufficient. And that's a good thing. But I think what Jesus says in Matthew 10 is really important. So in Matthew 10, you pick up verse 12. This is the limited commission during Jesus' ministry. And Jesus says, as you enter the house, greet it. And if the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it's not worthy, let your peace return to you. And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town. Truly I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. Now, what Jesus says is, listen, you have a message that is so valuable and people need to hear it, that if you get so bogged down in one place or one town or one person that you fail to share it with the rest of the people that need it, don't get bogged down. If they will receive it, great, and spend as much time as you need. But eventually, if they're not going to receive it, that's on them. And you have an obligation to shake the dust off your feet, go somewhere else to somebody who will hear. And I think sometimes we have gotten bogged down in particular people or particular, I don't know whatever it might be, but we have failed to shake off the dust and go to more receptive ground. And I think that's a big problem as well. So anyway, all of this to say, we're going to be talking about teaching with Tact. We're going to talk about evangelism over the course of this month. And at the end of this month, we'll have a evangelism door knocking type event. But the goal here is, look, we need to be taking our faith outside of these walls. And it's great to go worship with the people at the veranda. That's great. But we need to have more personalized experience doing this too. And I get that it's hard and it's uncomfortable. And every time I go, I feel uncomfortable. And I don't particularly just love going and doing it. But it gets easier the more you do it. You gain in confidence. And it's what we've been called to do. And so we're going to spend some time this month talking about some do's and don'ts of evangelism, and then put those things into practice. So we're going to offer the invitation. If you need to put Christ on in baptism, let me encourage you to do so. Maybe you've not done what you need to do, and you've not been the evangelistic, faithful Christian that you ought to be. Let me encourage you to make that change. If we can do anything for you, come forward as we stand and sing.
Jesus for the cleansing power, are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the soul cleansing blood?
For this day, and thank you for all the many blessings that you give us. And we're so thankful for opportunities to be with one another and to worship you and to serve you. And Father, help us to be the evangelistic Christians that you need us to be, and help us to be authentic in our faith and to plant and water. And we pray that you'll give increase here at Dayton. And Father, help us to leave here and be the people that we need to be in our work and schools and all the other places we may find ourselves in. Help us to be the light on the hill. We have a lot of people on our prayer list, and we know that you know all of those situations better than we do, and we ask that in all those situations you do what's right. Father, help us to trust in you in those hard times. In your Son's name we pray.